The first time I saw Zeftar, I thought he was going to kill me. Standing 7 feet tall with chitinous plates covering his elongated frame, forearms ending in razor-sharp claws, and eyes like molten copper that seemed to burn through whatever they focused on, he embodied every nightmare humanity had conjured about hostile alien life. His species, the Kethmori, had a reputation that preceded them across the galaxy: ruthless warriors, emotionless killing machines, beings who viewed combat as the only true expression of existence. When the Galactic Council assigned him as my companion for the deep space archaeological mission to the ruins of Zirion Prime, I assumed I was being sent to my death with a particularly efficient executioner. The irony wasn't lost on me that Marcus Chen, a xenoarchaeologist who had spent most of his 34 years buried in ancient texts and crumbling civilizations, would be paired with a creature whose people had likely destroyed more ancient civilizations than I had ever studied. The mission briefing had been typically sparse on details that might have helped me sleep better. Zirion Prime was a dead world that had once housed the Ethereal Archive, a repository of knowledge from dozens of extinct civilizations. The planet had been quarantined for 3 centuries after a plague wiped out its inhabitants, but recent scans suggested the automated defenses were finally failing. Someone needed to get in, catalog what remained, and get out before scavengers arrived to strip the place clean. The Council's reasoning for the partnership was coldly practical. They needed someone who could navigate and interpret the archives, and they needed someone who could keep that someone alive in what was likely to be a hostile environment. Zeftar had volunteered for the mission, a fact that puzzled me even more than his assignment as my protector. The Kethmori didn't volunteer for anything that didn't involve the possibility of glorious combat, and babysitting a human academic seemed unlikely to provide such opportunities. Our first meeting took place in the sterile briefing room aboard the research vessel Meridian. I had arrived early, spreading my research materials across the metal table and trying to project an air of professional competence I didn't feel. When the door hissed open and Zeftar entered, the temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. He moved with a fluid grace that seemed impossible for something so large, each step deliberate and calculated. His armor, if it could be called armor, since it seemed to be part of his actual body, caught the overhead lights and threw them back in harsh, geometric patterns. He studied me for what felt like an eternity, those copper eyes taking in every detail of my appearance, posture, and equipment. I found myself unconsciously cataloging escape routes, though I knew that if he decided to end me, my knowledge of the room's layout would be irrelevant. Finally, he spoke, his voice a low rumble that seemed to resonate from somewhere deep in his chest. "You are smaller than I expected," he said, and I couldn't tell if this was disappointment, surprise, or simple observation. His English was flawless, though heavily accented with the clicking consonants that characterized Kethmori speech. "You're exactly as large as I expected," I replied, then immediately regretted the words. Sarcasm probably wasn't the best opening gambit with a species known for settling disputes with ritual combat. To my surprise, something that might have been amusement flickered across his alien features. "You have spirit, at least. Good. Cowards die badly on worlds like Zirion Prime." That conversation set the tone for our early interactions, formal, professional, and weighted with the unspoken understanding that I was completely dependent on his skills for survival. During the 3-week journey to Zirion Prime, we maintained a careful distance. I spent my time reviewing every available piece of information about the Ethereal Archive, cross-referencing linguistic databases and cultural analysis reports. Zeftar spent his time in what I assumed was meditation, sitting motionless in his quarters for hours at a time, or in the ship's small gymnasium, practicing combat forms that looked more like deadly ballet than exercise. We spoke only when necessary, discussions about mission parameters, equipment checks, review of the planet's hazardous environmental conditions. He answered my questions with efficient brevity, volunteering no information beyond what was directly relevant. I learned that he had served in the Kethmori military for what translated to roughly 15 Earth years, that he had extensive experience in hostile environment operations, and that he had specifically requested assignment to archaeological missions. This last detail intrigued me, though my attempts to learn more met with polite but firm deflection. It wasn't until our 5th day in hyperspace that I began to suspect there might be more to my companion than the stereotypical Kethmori warrior. I had been working late in the ship's small library, cross-referencing symbols from the preliminary scans of Zirion Prime with known ethereal script variants, when I became aware that I was no longer alone. Zeftar stood in the doorway, motionless as always, but his attention was focused not on me but on the holographic displays I had arranged around my workspace. "The third symbol in the sequence," he said without preamble, "the one you have classified as unknown, it appears in Kethmori historical texts." I looked up from my notes, startled both by his unexpected presence and by his observation. "You read ethereal script?" "Not fluently," he replied, moving closer to examine the display. "But there are similarities to older forms of our own written language. This symbol," he indicated the glyph I had been struggling with for hours, "in ancient Kethmori, it meant transformation through trial or strength born of suffering." The accuracy of his translation became clear as I ran it through the linguistic analysis programs. The symbol did indeed fit the contextual pattern I had been missing, and, with that piece in place, the entire sequence began to make sense. It was a dedication inscription, commemorating those who had died in pursuit of knowledge. "How do you know ancient Kethmori script?" I asked, my academic curiosity overriding my caution. For the first time since I had met him, Zeftar hesitated before answering. "My previous role required study of historical texts. Battle strategies, tactical analyses, such documents often contained linguistic elements that predated modern Kethmori." There was something in his tone that suggested this explanation, while not entirely false, was far from complete. But, before I could probe further, he had withdrawn, leaving me alone with my research and a growing sense that my supposedly straightforward warrior companion was considerably more complex than he appeared. The first real crack in his stoic facade appeared 3 days later. I had been reviewing personnel files and expedition reports when I came across a reference that made me reconsider everything I thought I knew about Kethmori culture. A footnote in an anthropological study mentioned a subset of Kethmori society called the Kebnash, roughly translated as memory keepers or guardians of what was. According to the limited information available, these individuals were responsible for preserving their species' history and cultural knowledge, a role that required not only physical prowess but also extensive scholarly training. The text included a brief description of the Kebnash selection process, a brutal combination of physical, mental, and spiritual trials that fewer than 1% of candidates survived. Those who succeeded were considered to embody the highest ideals of Kethmori civilization: strength balanced with wisdom, warrior skill tempered by scholarly dedication, the ability to preserve the past while adapting to an uncertain future. When I mentioned the Kebnash during our next mission briefing, Zeftar's reaction was immediate and unmistakable. His entire body went rigid, his breathing stopped for several seconds, and his copper eyes took on an intensity that made me instinctively lean back in my chair. The silence stretched between us until I began to wonder if I had inadvertently committed some grave cultural offense. "Where," he said finally, his voice carefully controlled, "did you encounter that term?" I explained about the anthropological study, noting the scarcity of information and the author's admission that most of his sources were fragmentary or secondhand. As I spoke, I watched Zeftar's expression shift through what I was beginning to recognize as his equivalent of internal struggle: minute changes in posture, the slight narrowing of his eyes, the way his secondary arms moved almost imperceptibly closer to his body. "The study is incomplete," he said at last. "The author lacked access to primary sources." "Were you able to learn more during your military service?" I pressed, my scholarly instincts overriding my sense of self-preservation. He was quiet for so long that I thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that suggested the words cost him considerable effort. "I was Kebnash," he said simply. "I am Kebnash still, though I no longer serve in that capacity." The revelation recontextualized everything I thought I knew about our mission and my companion. The Kebnash weren't just scholars, they were the living memory of their species, entrusted with preserving knowledge that might otherwise be lost forever. For such an individual to volunteer for what amounted to a salvage mission suggested motivations far more complex than I had imagined. "Why are you here?" I asked, and immediately realized how blunt the question sounded. "I mean, why this mission? Why archaeology instead of whatever it is the Kebnash normally do?" His answer, when it came, was so quiet I almost missed it. "Because I failed." That conversation marked the beginning of a different kind of relationship between us. The formal distance remained, but underneath it grew a current of mutual recognition, scholar to scholar, individuals who had dedicated their lives to understanding the past and found themselves questioning their place in the present. He began to volunteer information during our research sessions, offering insights into linguistic patterns and cultural contexts that proved invaluable in preparing for Zirian Prime. In return, I shared my own knowledge more freely, explaining the methodologies and theoretical frameworks that guided archaeological investigation. It was during one of these sessions that I first saw him experience something that looked like joy. We had been working on a particularly complex section of the archive's indexing system, trying to understand how the ethereals had organized their vast collection of knowledge. The pattern had seemed random until Zeftar suggested approaching it from the perspective of emotional association rather than logical categorization. Following his insight, I realized that the ethereals had arranged their archive not by subject or chronology, but by the emotional resonance of the knowledge itself. Texts that inspired hope grouped together, documents that warned of tragedy clustered in another section, works of pure beauty arranged in spiraling patterns that mimic the mathematical constants underlying their aesthetic philosophy. When the pattern finally became clear, displayed in three-dimensional glory on our holographic projector, Zeftar made a sound I had never heard from a Kethmori, a low, harmonic resonance that seemed to express wonder and satisfaction in equal measure. His copper eyes brightened, and, for a moment, the rigid control that governed his every movement relaxed. He looked like someone who had just witnessed something beautiful. Elegant, he said, and the word carried layers of meaning that went far beyond simple appreciation. They understood that knowledge without emotional context is merely data. They preserved not just what their civilizations knew, but what they felt about that knowledge. It was the most philosophical statement I had ever heard him make, and it offered the first real glimpse into the mind behind the warrior's facade. In that moment, I began to understand that Zeftar's dedication to scholarship wasn't separate from his warrior identity, it was the foundation of it. For the Kethmori, true strength came not from the ability to destroy, but from the wisdom to know what was worth preserving. The remainder of our journey to Zirian Prime passed in a blur of collaborative research and growing mutual respect. We developed a working relationship that bordered on partnership, with Zeftar's cultural insights and linguistic knowledge complementing my archaeological training and analytical skills. By the time we entered the dead system that housed our destination, I had begun to think of him not as my assigned protector, but as my colleague. Zirian Prime hung in the darkness like a diseased jewel, its surface scarred by the cataclysm that had ended its civilization 3 centuries earlier. The automated defense grid that had kept the planet quarantined for so long flickered weakly, its energy patterns irregular and failing. According to our sensors, we had perhaps a month before the system collapsed entirely and the planet became accessible to anyone with a ship and a willingness to risk the lingering effects of the plague. Our landing site was a plateau approximately 10 kilometers from the Ethereal Archive's main entrance. The shuttle's sensors detected no immediate threats, but the atmosphere carried trace amounts of the viral agent that had destroyed the planet's population. Our environmental suits were rated for protection against known biological hazards, but the ethereal plague was notorious for its ability to mutate and adapt. We would need to move quickly and efficiently to minimize exposure. The archive itself was a marvel of engineering and artistry that took my breath away even through the suit's visual filters. Rising from the plateau's center like a crystal mountain, its translucent walls caught and refracted the system's pale sunlight into rainbow patterns that shifted and flowed with hypnotic beauty. The entrance was sealed by a barrier of what looked like solid light, pulsing gently with internal rhythms that suggested it was more than merely decorative. The Guardian systems are still active, Zeftar observed, running his scanner along the barrier's edge. Energy output is minimal, but the pattern suggests selective permeability rather than simple defense. I approached the barrier carefully, noting the way the light seemed to intensify as I drew near. The patterns in the luminous surface were incredibly complex, not random, but following mathematical principles that teased at the edge of understanding. As I studied them more closely, I began to recognize elements that corresponded to the symbolic systems we had analyzed during our journey. It's a test, I realized aloud. Not a lock, but an examination. The patterns are questions: linguistic, mathematical, philosophical. The barrier isn't meant to keep people out, it's meant to ensure that only those with sufficient knowledge and understanding can enter. Zeftar joined me at the barrier's edge, his scanner forgotten as he studied the flowing patterns of light. The ethereals valued wisdom above all else, he said quietly. Even in death, they seek to ensure their legacy passes only to those worthy of it. Working together, we began to decode the barrier's questions. Some were straightforward mathematical equations, linguistic puzzles, requests for specific historical knowledge. Others were more abstract, requiring not just information but insight, not just knowledge but understanding. The process was exhausting, requiring total concentration and perfect coordination between us. But, gradually, the barrier began to respond. The light grew brighter, the patterns more complex, and then, suddenly, the entire surface shimmered and dissolved, revealing the archive's interior. We stood at the threshold of the greatest repository of knowledge the galaxy had ever known, two beings from different worlds united by their shared dedication to understanding and preserving the past. Together? Zeftar asked, and I nodded. We stepped forward into the archive, and everything changed. The interior of the ethereal archive defied every assumption I had made about the structure's organization and purpose. What I had expected to find was a library in the traditional sense, corridors lined with data storage units, reading chambers filled with research terminals, perhaps some kind of central catalog system to help visitors navigate the vast collection. What we discovered instead was something that challenged the very concepts of knowledge storage and retrieval. The entrance chamber opened into a vast spherical space that seemed to extend infinitely in all directions. The floor beneath our feet was solid enough, but the walls and ceiling dissolved into a soft, luminous haze that made it impossible to judge the room's actual dimensions. Floating throughout this space, at various heights and distances, were what appeared to be clusters of crystalline structures, each one pulsing with its own internal light and connected to its neighbors by streams of energy that flowed like rivers of liquid starlight. "It's beautiful," I whispered, and immediately felt foolish for stating something so obvious. But the archive was beautiful in a way that went beyond mere aesthetics. It possessed a harmony of form and function that spoke to something deeper than visual appreciation. Zeftar had stopped beside me, his scanner held loosely in one of his secondary hands. For once, his attention wasn't focused on potential threats or tactical considerations. He was staring at the floating knowledge clusters with an expression I was learning to recognize as his version of wonder. "The connections," he said, pointing to the energy streams that linked the crystalline structures. "They're not random. There's a pattern, knowledge calling to knowledge, concepts finding their natural relationships regardless of their source or origin." He was right. As my eyes adjusted to the chamber's strange illumination, I began to see the underlying order that governed the archive's organization. Knowledge wasn't stored here in the linear fashion I was accustomed to. It existed in a web of interconnection where every piece of information influenced and was influenced by every other piece. Understanding wasn't found by retrieving isolated facts, but by following the flowing connections between related concepts. Near the center of the chamber, a cluster of particularly bright crystals pulsed in synchronized patterns that seemed somehow familiar. As I studied them more closely, I realized they were responding to our presence, their light shifting and intensifying as if acknowledging our arrival. One crystal in particular, a structure about the size of my torso that glowed with soft blue radiance, seemed to be calling for attention. "An interface," I guessed, pointing toward the beckoning crystal. "A way for visitors to communicate with the archive system." We approached carefully, mindful that we were dealing with technology far beyond our understanding. The crystal's surface was smooth and warm to the touch, despite the environmental suit's insulation. As my gloved hand made contact, the entire chamber around us shifted. The floating knowledge clusters realigned themselves, their energy connections flowing in new patterns that created a pathway leading deeper into the archive. More importantly, the crystal began to project images and symbols directly into our minds, not through any technological interface I recognized, but through some form of direct neural communication that bypassed our conscious awareness and spoke to deeper levels of understanding. The first images were welcoming messages in a dozen different languages, including both Human Standard and Kethmori Primary Script. The ethereals, it seemed, had been prepared for visitors from many different worlds and cultures. But, as the communication continued, it became clear that this was more than a simple greeting. The archive was evaluating us, determining what we sought and whether we were qualified to receive it. I felt the system probe gently at the edges of my consciousness, examining my motivations and intentions with a thoroughness that should have been alarming but somehow felt completely natural. It found my dedication to preserving knowledge, my respect for the cultures I studied, my genuine desire to understand rather than simply to possess. Apparently satisfied, it turned its attention to Zeftar. What happened next was unexpected and revealing. The crystal's light shifted from blue to deep amber, and the mental contact became more intense. I caught fragmentary impressions of the evaluation images of Kethmori history, battles fought not for conquest but for preservation, the weight of cultural memory carried by generations of Kevnash. But, beneath these surface elements, the system found something that made it pause in what felt like surprise. The crystal pulsed brighter, its amber light taking on undertones of gold and green. Through our shared connection, I felt the archive's amazement at what it had discovered in Zeftar's mind, not just knowledge and dedication, but a profound capacity for wonder that seemed to transcend species boundaries. The Ethereals had built their archive not just as a repository but as a celebration of the joy that came from understanding, and, in my alien companion, they had found a kindred spirit. Remarkable, a voice whispered directly into our consciousness, carrying harmonics that suggested it was a composite of many different speakers. In all our years of guardianship, we have rarely encountered a mind that approaches knowledge with such perfect balance of wisdom and wonder. You are welcome here, memory keeper of the Kethmori. You and your companion both. The formal evaluation complete, the archive opened itself to us in ways I could never have imagined. The floating crystal clusters revealed themselves to be vast repositories of information from hundreds of different civilizations, not just the dry facts of history and science, but the living essence of cultures preserved in their full complexity. Art, literature, music, philosophical treatises, scientific discoveries, religious traditions, even the daily life experiences of ordinary individuals, all of it preserved with a fidelity that made the past feel immediately present. For Zeftar, the archive's offerings seemed to provide something he had been searching for without even realizing it. As we explored the various knowledge clusters, I watched his rigid composure gradually give way to something approaching enthusiasm. His questions became more frequent and more complex, his insights more sophisticated. When we discovered a section dedicated to comparative warrior philosophies from across the galaxy, he spent hours absorbing the information with an intensity that bordered on reverence. But it was when we found the ethereal's own cultural memories that I saw him experience what could only be described as pure joy. The cluster containing their artistic achievements was a symphony of light and sound that conveyed not just the form of their creations, but the emotional states that had inspired them. As the information flowed through our shared mental connection, Zeftar made that same harmonic sound I had heard during our research sessions, but deeper and more sustained. His copper eyes brightened until they seemed to glow with their own internal light. They understood, he said, his voice carrying undertones I had never heard before: wonder, validation, something approaching ecstasy. They knew that true strength comes not from the ability to destroy, but from the capacity to create, to preserve, to find beauty in complexity. Through the mental link, I felt an echo of what he was experiencing, the profound satisfaction that came from discovering that fundamental truths transcended species boundaries, that the values he had dedicated his life to preserving were not merely cultural artifacts but universal principles. For someone who had been trained from childhood to bear the weight of his species' memory, finding validation for those beliefs in the preserved thoughts of an entirely different civilization was clearly transformative. We spent our first day in the archive learning to navigate its unique organizational system. Unlike conventional libraries, where information was categorized by subject or format, the ethereal system organized knowledge by conceptual relationship and emotional resonance. To find information about, say, engineering principles, you didn't search for engineering, you followed connections from related concepts like construction, creativity, or problem solving, allowing the archive's intelligence to guide you toward the specific information you needed. The process was intuitive once you understood it, but it required a fundamental shift in thinking. You couldn't approach the archive with predetermined goals or rigid expectations. Instead, you had to remain open to unexpected connections, allowing your research to evolve organically as you discovered relationships between seemingly unrelated concepts. Zeftar adapted to this system with surprising ease. His training as a Kevnash had taught him to see knowledge as an interconnected web rather than a collection of discrete facts, and his warrior's discipline allowed him to follow conceptual paths without becoming distracted by irrelevant tangents. More importantly, he seemed to genuinely enjoy the process of discovery, approaching each new revelation with an enthusiasm that transformed his normally stoic demeanor. On our second day, while I was absorbed in cataloging the archive's organizational principles for my eventual report, Zeftar discovered something that changed the entire nature of our mission. He had been following a chain of connections related to preservation techniques when he stumbled upon a cluster of crystals that seemed somehow different from the others. Where most of the archive's knowledge was passive, waiting to be accessed by interested visitors, these crystals seemed almost eager to share their contents. "Marcus," he called, using my first name for the first time since we had met. "You need to see this." The cluster he had found contained what the ethereals called their living archive, not just records of their civilization's achievements, but active simulations of their greatest minds preserved in crystalline matrices. These weren't simple recordings or artificial intelligences, but genuine consciousness transfers that had allowed their civilization's most brilliant individuals to survive the plague that destroyed their physical forms. As the implications sank in, I realized that we had discovered something that would revolutionize our understanding of consciousness, identity, and the nature of existence itself. The ethereals hadn't just built a library, they had created a form of immortality, allowing their civilization to continue existing in digital form long after their biological extinction. But, more importantly for our immediate situation, it meant that we weren't alone in the archive. We were surrounded by the living minds of beings who had devoted their existence to the pursuit and preservation of knowledge, and who had been waiting 3 centuries for someone worthy to discover their sanctuary. The first consciousness to make contact was an individual who identified herself as Lyroeth, described as a seeker of harmonious understanding who had specialized in facilitating communication between different species and cultures. Her personality manifested as a warm, melodious presence that seemed to sparkle with good humor and genuine curiosity about her unexpected visitors. "Welcome, travelers from distant stars," she said, her mental voice carrying undertones of music that made communication feel like an art form. "We have been waiting so long for minds capable of appreciating what we have preserved here. Tell us, what draws you to seek the knowledge of the past?" I explained our mission in broad terms, describing the archaeological expedition and our hope to catalog and preserve what remained of the archive before scavengers could plunder it. But, as I spoke, I became aware that Lyroeth was more interested in our motivations than our objectives, more curious about who we were than what we intended to accomplish. "Ah," she said when I finished, and I felt her attention turn toward Zeftar. "And you, noble warrior, what brings a guardian of memory so far from his home stars?" The question seemed to catch Zeftar off guard. For several seconds, he remained silent, and I could feel his internal struggle through our shared connection to the archive. Finally, he answered with the same painful honesty he had shown during our journey. "I seek understanding," he said simply. "I have spent my life preserving the knowledge of my people, but I have begun to question whether preservation without growth is merely an elaborate form of decay. I hoped that studying how other civilizations approach these challenges might help me find a path forward." Lyroeth's response carried such warmth and compassion that it felt like being embraced. "Oh, my dear guardian, you have come to exactly the right place. The question you pose, the balance between preservation and growth, between honoring the past and embracing the future, was the central challenge of our entire civilization. We spent millennia exploring different approaches, and our archive contains the wisdom we accumulated along the way. What followed was unlike any educational experience I had ever encountered. Rather than simply accessing information, we were guided through a carefully structured exploration of how dozens of different civilizations had grappled with the fundamental questions that plagued Zeftar's mind. We experienced firsthand the rise and fall of cultures that had become so obsessed with preserving their traditions that they stagnated and died, and others that had embraced change so completely that they lost all connection to their origins. But, most importantly, we learned about civilizations that had found ways to honor their past while remaining open to growth and transformation. The ethereals themselves were the ultimate example, a species that had managed to preserve the essence of their culture even while transcending the limitations of biological existence. As the days passed, I watched Zeftar undergo a profound transformation. The rigid control that had characterized his every action began to give way to something more fluid and natural. He laughed, actually laughed, producing that harmonic resonance with increasing frequency as he discovered concepts and connections that delighted him. He asked questions with genuine curiosity rather than dutiful diligence. Most remarkably, he began to express opinions and insights that went beyond mere recitation of established knowledge. The change was most apparent when we encountered the archive section dedicated to what the ethereals called the art of joyful discovery. This wasn't a formal academic discipline, but rather a philosophy that approached learning and understanding as sources of pleasure and wonder rather than mere obligation. The section contained thousands of examples of individuals from different species and cultures who had found genuine happiness in the pursuit of knowledge. "This is what I have been missing," Zeftar said after absorbing a particularly beautiful example of mathematical poetry from a civilization that had expressed their deepest insights through number sequences. His voice carried an intensity one had never heard before, not the controlled focus of a warrior or the careful precision of a scholar, but the passion of someone who had finally found what they had been searching for without even knowing they were searching. "Among my people, knowledge is duty," he continued, his words coming faster as ideas crystallized in his mind. "We preserve because we must, we learn because it is required, we remember because forgetting would be a form of death." But these beings, they knew that knowledge pursued with joy is preserved more deeply than knowledge maintained through obligation alone. Through the mental link we shared with the archive, I felt his wonder as he realized that his culture's approach to preservation, while admirable, was incomplete. The Kethmori had mastered the art of maintaining information across generations, but they had forgotten how to celebrate the beauty and wonder that made knowledge worth preserving in the first place. It was on our 5th day in the archive that Zeftar experienced what I can only describe as an epiphany. We had been exploring a section dedicated to transformation narratives, stories and case studies of individuals and cultures that had undergone fundamental change while retaining their essential identity. The examples ranged from personal growth stories to entire civilizations that had successfully navigated paradigm shifts without losing their core values. One particular narrative caught his attention, the story of a warrior scholar from a species not unlike the Kethmori, who had struggled with the same questions that plagued my companion. This individual had spent decades serving as a guardian of cultural memory before realizing that true preservation required not just maintaining the past, but ensuring it remained alive and meaningful for each new generation. The warrior scholar's solution had been elegant in its simplicity. Instead of merely preserving knowledge, he had begun to teach others how to find joy in discovery, showing them that learning could be a source of wonder rather than a burden. By helping his people rediscover their enthusiasm for understanding, he had ensured that their cultural memory would remain vibrant and growing rather than static and brittle. As Zeftar absorbed this story, I felt the moment when understanding crystallized into certainty. His entire body relaxed, his breathing deepened, and his copper eyes took on a brightness that seemed to come from within. When he spoke, his voice carried a conviction I had never heard before. "I know what I must do," he said simply. "I cannot return to my old role, I am no longer the same being who left Kethmor Prime. But I can become something new, something that honors what I was while embracing what I might become." The transformation was visible in every aspect of his behavior. Where once he had moved with rigid precision, he now displayed a fluidity that spoke of confidence rather than control. His interactions with the archive's consciousness became more natural and spontaneous. Most remarkably, he began to express emotions openly, wonder at particularly elegant solutions, amusement at clever philosophical paradoxes, genuine affection for the personalities we encountered among the preserved minds. But perhaps the most significant change was in how he related to our mission itself. What had begun as a duty assignment had become a genuine collaboration, with both of us contributing our unique perspectives and abilities to the larger goal of understanding and preserving the archive's treasures. He no longer saw himself as my protector first and scholar second, he had become my full partner in the work that mattered to both of us. On our 7th day, as we prepared to begin the formal documentation process that would comprise our official report to the Galactic Council, Zeftar approached me with a proposal that took me completely by surprise. "I want to request permanent assignment to this project," he said without preamble. "Not as security personnel or cultural consultant, but as a full member of the research team. The archive contains knowledge that could transform how we understand preservation, education, and the relationship between past and future. This work deserves more than a quick survey and evacuation. I stared at him, trying to process the implications of his request. What about your duties to the Kethmori? Your responsibilities as Kebnash? His answer revealed the depth of the change he had undergone. My highest responsibility is to ensure that knowledge lives and grows rather than merely endures. I can serve that purpose better here, learning from the greatest teachers the galaxy has ever known, than I can by returning to a role that had become mere ritual. As he spoke, I realized that his transformation had been paralleled by my own. Working with the archive had changed my understanding of what it meant to be an archaeologist. Instead of studying dead civilizations, I was participating in a living dialogue with minds that had transcended the limitations of time and mortality. Instead of cataloging artifacts, I was helping to preserve and transmit wisdom that could benefit countless future generations. The decision we made that day would have consequences neither of us could fully anticipate. But, standing in the heart of the ethereal archive, surrounded by the collected wisdom of 100 civilizations and watched over by the loving intelligence of beings who had dedicated their existence to the preservation of knowledge, it felt like the most natural choice in the universe. We would stay. We would learn. And we would ensure that the joy we had found in discovery would be passed on to others who came after us. The decision to remain at the archive required extensive negotiations with the Galactic Council, but the preliminary data we transmitted made it clear that we had discovered something far more significant than a simple repository of ancient knowledge. The revelation that the Ethereals had achieved a form of digital immortality sent shockwaves through the academic and political communities, and, suddenly, our quiet archaeological mission had become the most important research project in known space. Additional team members began arriving within weeks: xenobiologists, consciousness researchers, philosophers, and diplomatic specialists who came to study different aspects of the archive's treasures. But the core of the operation remained the partnership that Zeftar and I had developed during those first crucial days of discovery. We had become the primary liaisons with the preserved consciousnesses, and our unique perspective on the archive's organization made us irreplaceable guides for the expanding research effort. Working with the new arrivals gave me the opportunity to observe Zeftar's continued transformation from a different angle. Where once he had been focused entirely on duty and obligation, he now approached each day with genuine enthusiasm for whatever discoveries might await. His interactions with the various specialists were marked by curiosity rather than caution, and he seemed to take particular pleasure in sharing insights that helped others understand concepts they had been struggling with. Dr. Elena Vasquez, the team's lead consciousness researcher, was particularly impressed by Zeftar's intuitive understanding of how the preserved minds functioned. He doesn't just communicate with them, she told me after observing one of his sessions with a collective of ethereal philosophers. He harmonizes with them, finding a frequency of interaction that allows for deeper exchange than I've ever seen between different species. The observation was accurate. Zeftar had developed an almost telepathic connection with the archive's inhabitants, able to understand not just their words but their underlying emotional and conceptual frameworks. This ability made him invaluable as a translator and interpreter, but, more importantly, it had given him access to forms of knowledge that were impossible to convey through conventional academic channels. It was during a session with one of these collective consciousnesses that Zeftar made a discovery that would define the rest of his life's work. He had been exploring the Ethereal's educational methodologies when he encountered a group mind dedicated to what they called the cultivation of wonder, a systematic approach to fostering the kind of joyful curiosity that had once driven their civilization's greatest achievements. The collective, identifying itself as the Gardeners of Inquiry, had spent millennia developing techniques for helping individuals discover the deep satisfaction that came from understanding. Their methods went far beyond conventional teaching, incorporating elements of art, philosophy, and what could only be described as spiritual practice to create learning experiences that transformed students at the deepest level of their being. We sought to nurture not just knowledge, but the love of knowledge, explained the collective's primary voice, a harmonious blend of dozens of different personalities. We understood that facts without passion are merely noise, but passion guided by understanding can illuminate entire universes. As Zeftar absorbed their teachings, I watched him undergo yet another transformation, not the dramatic shift from warrior to scholar that had marked his earlier development, but a subtler evolution toward something entirely new. He was becoming an educator, not in the traditional sense of someone who simply transmitted information, but in the deeper meaning of one who helped others discover the joy of learning itself. The change was most apparent when members of our expanding research team came to him for guidance. Instead of simply answering their questions, he began to lead them through processes of discovery that helped them find their own insights. His sessions became legendary among the staff, not because he possessed more knowledge than anyone else, but because he had developed an almost supernatural ability to help others find wonder in whatever they were studying. Dr. James Morrison, a historian specializing in extinct civilizations, described the experience after one of Zefdar's guidance sessions. I came to him with a translation problem, a set of glyphs that didn't match any known linguistic patterns. Instead of helping me decode them, he asked me to consider what emotions the shapes themselves might represent. Within an hour, I wasn't just reading the text, I was feeling what the original authors had felt when they wrote it. It was like the difference between analyzing a symphony and actually hearing the music. As months passed and our research team grew into a permanent installation, Zefdar's role evolved from consultant to something approaching spiritual guide. He had no formal title, the Galactic Council's bureaucratic structures had no category for what he had become, but everyone understood that he was the heart of the operation, the individual who helped others find meaning in their work rather than merely completing their assigned tasks. For my part, I found myself serving as Zefdar's closest collaborator in this new form of education. My archaeological training had taught me to see patterns and connections across different cultures and time periods, skills that proved invaluable in helping translate the ethereal's teaching methods into forms that could benefit our diverse research team. Together, we developed what we called the Resonance Protocol, a systematic approach to learning that combined rigorous academic methodology with the wonder cultivation techniques we had learned from the archived minds. The protocol's effectiveness was remarkable. Researchers who had been struggling with complex problems for months would achieve breakthroughs within days of beginning resonance training. More importantly, they began to find genuine satisfaction in their work, approaching each new challenge with enthusiasm rather than mere professional duty. Word of our methods began to spread throughout the academic community, and requests for training and consultation poured in from universities and research institutions across the galaxy. But Zefdar was reluctant to leave the archive, feeling that his most important work lay in continuing to learn from the ethereals while helping our immediate team reach their full potential. It was Lyraeth who finally convinced him to share his gifts more broadly. During one of their regular conversations, she posed a challenge that perfectly captured the dilemma he faced. Noble Guardian, you have learned to find joy in discovery, but joy that is hoarded becomes mere pleasure. True joy must be shared to achieve its full expression. The question is not whether you should teach others, but whether you can afford not to. Her words resonated with everything Zefdar had learned about the balance between preservation and growth. Knowledge that remained locked away, no matter how carefully protected, was ultimately worthless if it couldn't be passed on to future generations. More importantly, the joy he had found in learning was too valuable to keep to himself. It was meant to be shared, multiplied, passed from teacher to student in an endless cycle of discovery and wonder. The solution we developed was elegant in its simplicity. Rather than leaving the archive permanently, Zefdar would divide his time between his work with the preserved consciousnesses and teaching missions to various academic institutions. These visits became known as Wonder Residencies, intensive programs where he would spend several weeks with a research team or academic department, helping them discover the joy that could transform their work from obligation into celebration. The impact of these residencies was extraordinary. Institutions that had been struggling with low morale, creative stagnation, or interdisciplinary conflicts found their problems dissolving as faculty and students rediscovered their passion for learning. Research productivity increased, but, more importantly, the quality of research improved as investigators approached their work with renewed enthusiasm and deeper insight. But, perhaps the most significant measure of Zefdar's influence was the number of his students who went on to develop their own wonder cultivation practices. Like seeds carried by wind, his teaching methods spread throughout the academic community, creating a network of educators who shared his commitment to nurturing joy and discovery. Within 5 years of his first residency, resonance education had become a recognized field of study, with formal programs being established at major universities across the galaxy. Throughout this period of growth and expansion, Zefdar remained fundamentally changed from the rigid warrior I had first met aboard the research vessel Meridian. The transformation wasn't simply a matter of new interests or different priorities, it was as if he had discovered a previously unknown aspect of his own nature, a capacity for joy and wonder that had been present all along but suppressed by the weight of duty and expectation. His physical presence had changed as well. Where once he had moved with the controlled precision of a combat veteran, he now displayed a fluid grace that seemed to come from complete comfort with himself and his environment. His copper eyes, once distant and calculating, now held a warmth that made others feel immediately welcome in his presence. Even his voice had evolved, losing the harsh edge that had characterized his early speech and taking on the musical quality that the ethereals associated with harmonious communication. But the most remarkable change was in how he related to others. The careful distance that had once marked all his interactions had been replaced by genuine connection. He remembered personal details about everyone he worked with, celebrated their successes as enthusiastically as his own, and offered support during difficult periods with a compassion that seemed to come from deep personal understanding of struggle and transformation. He has become what our legends called a true teacher, one of the ethereal consciousnesses told me during a private conversation. Such beings appear rarely in any civilization, individuals who have learned not just to acquire knowledge, but to kindle the flame of understanding in others. They are treasures beyond measure, for they ensure that the joy of discovery survives and spreads to future generations. The assessment was accurate. Zeftar had evolved into something that transcended traditional categories, not quite teacher, not quite researcher, not quite spiritual guide, but somehow all of these things combined into something entirely new. He had found his true calling in helping others discover their own capacity for wonder, and, in doing so, had created a legacy that would outlast any individual achievement or accomplishment. As I write this account, 5 years have passed since our first day in the Ethereal Archive. The research station has grown into a permanent installation with over 200 full-time staff members representing dozens of different species and academic disciplines. The archive's treasures continue to yield new insights and discoveries, contributing to advances in fields ranging from consciousness studies to interstellar communication. But the project's most important contribution may be the transformation it has catalyzed in how we approach learning and knowledge itself. The wonder cultivation techniques pioneered by Zeftar and refined through collaboration with the archived minds have spread throughout academic institutions across the galaxy, creating a renaissance of enthusiasm for discovery that shows no signs of diminishing. And, at the center of it all remains my former bodyguard, the Kethmori warrior who discovered that true strength lay not in the ability to preserve the past unchanged, but in the wisdom to help it grow and flourish in new forms. His journey from dutiful guardian to joyful teacher has become a legend in its own right, inspiring others to question their own assumptions about identity, purpose, and the possibilities for personal transformation. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others. This ancient wisdom has proven itself in Zeftar's story. By abandoning the rigid limitations of his original role and embracing his capacity for growth and change, he has become something stronger and more enduring than any warrior. He has become a force for transformation in the galaxy, a living example of how joy and wonder can triumph over duty and obligation. The most remarkable aspect of Zeftar's transformation is how natural it has appeared to those who know him now. Students who have only experienced his current incarnation find it difficult to imagine him as the stoic warrior he once was. His capacity for wonder and enthusiasm seems so fundamental to his character that it's easy to forget it was once buried beneath layers of cultural conditioning and personal limitation. He has always been exactly who he is now, one of his longtime students told me recently. The difference is that now he allows others to see his true nature instead of hiding behind the mask of what others expected him to be. The observation captures something essential about the nature of transformation itself. Zeftar didn't become someone different, he became more completely himself, discovering and expressing aspects of his nature that had been present all along but never allowed to flourish. The warrior's discipline remained, but now it served wonder rather than mere duty. The scholar's dedication persisted, but now it was fueled by joy rather than obligation. As I conclude this account, I'm struck by the realization that Zeftar's story is not unique in its essential elements. Everyone possesses capacities for growth and transformation that lie dormant until the right circumstances allow them to emerge. The miracle is not that change is possible, but that it remains possible regardless of how thoroughly we may have convinced ourselves that we are fixed and unchangeable. The ethereal archive taught us many things about the nature of knowledge, consciousness, and the preservation of culture across the vast expanses of time and space. But perhaps its greatest lesson was the simplest, that joy in discovery is not a luxury or an indulgence, but the very foundation of all meaningful learning and growth. Zefdar embodies this lesson in every aspect of his being. Through his transformation from guardian to guide, from preserver to cultivator, from warrior to teacher, he has shown that the highest form of strength is the courage to become who we truly are rather than who we think we should be. In finding real joy, he has discovered not just personal fulfillment, but a way to share that fulfillment with others, creating ripples of transformation that continue to spread throughout the galaxy. To my surprise, my alien companion found real joy. But, in truth, the surprise was mine alone. The capacity for joy was always there, waiting for the right moment and the right circumstances to reveal itself. All that was required was the courage to let go of old limitations and embrace the possibility of becoming something new. In the end, that may be the most important lesson of all, that transformation is not about destroying who we are, but about discovering who we have always had the potential to become. Zefdar's journey from warrior to teacher, from duty to joy, from preservation to cultivation, is a testament to the profound truth that the man who destroys his weak self, his limited, fear-bound, culturally constrained self, can never be destroyed by others, for he has become something far stronger, himself, fully realized and free to grow.